Hello, everyone. This is episode 36 of High Fantasy, members of the Broken Jars Network. And today we have Colin fill in. Hi, Tyler.
How's it going?
Pretty good, I guess. Have you been productive since last time you appeared with High Fantasy?
Yeah,
Which was like a year ago.
I hope so. It's been a while. Let's see. I talked sometime in October, November timeframe. So yeah, I've written 90,000 words.
That's impressive.
Yeah,
That is here. That is impressive. Yeah.
I had a lot of time, so I think you guys actually write about 90,000 words a year. It's just that you end up erasing a lot of it. And
Maybe. That's being
Lord
generous.
knows I'm bad. I'm
Yeah.
bad about it.
I might write that much in my world building notes. I don't know. I don't track those.
well, that's all part of it too, though.
Jacob, have you been productive?
I actually have been. I'm excited. I seem to be out of this rut I've been in. I've done like 4,500 words, which isn't huge in 2 weeks, but it's a whole lot better than I was doing. And I'm actually like making progress, going down the line, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So very excited. AL's coming along. We're probably like 20,000 words away, maybe, if that, from the end, quote unquote, before subsequent rewrites, redos, mass deletions, mass redoings, but at least it'll be done. It'll be out there on paper. So, and I found this new editor I really like. It's actually for Markdown, which is, if you're familiar with Reddit, that's how they do all their stuff, is with Markdown. And I really enjoy that. It's been great.
You have a programming thing that you use to write stories?
Well, Markdown is a formatting language. A lot of people use it. I really like it. It's clean. It's simple. It's pretty distraction free. It works on every web browser, so I don't have to fight like with Google or anything about it. So that's been really helpful.
All right. I have not written things. I have decided to start actually trying to draw so I can do the urban fantasy story as I want to. That is better and worse than I expected. It turns out I can draw bodies okay. I cannot draw faces very well at all anymore. I used to be able to, so that's going to be uncomfortable to get goodish at again. And since it's been a decent amount of time, I looked back at the plot and just decided to change a few things. And those changes have been really good. I'm pretty happy with that part.
We're
A thing.
So in your not Dresden story, how have you changed things to be more or less Dresden?
A little bit less, although I might be changing the name of the cat to make it more Dresden-y. Because at the moment, his name is Ash, which I'm meh about, because I really want to name him Monster, but that's really, really close to Mister.
Should I call him like Godzilla or something? So it's in the monster. Pick a monster name or kaiju.
Kaiju would be topically relevant. Or
It
not
would not-
topically, but relevant to our
It wouldn't
times.
fit my character to name him that, but it would fit her to name him Monster in like a weird satirical way. And because he's kind of like Mister, he's gigantic. It's the same sentiment of I have a monster under my bed and it's Mouse. I have a monster on my face and it's my cat. And I really like that thing. And I'm just like, I get really conflicted about it because it gets really close to Dresden at that point.
Well, if that's going to be close to Dresden, I don't think that's a bad thing. If your plot's too close to Dresden, that's when it becomes bad.
Yeah,
don't
all the
think the-
things. Good.
I don't think the plot's too close to Dresden. I don't have any overarching outer gates outsiders going to eat the world type thing yet. And if I avoid that, I think I'll be okay. If I basically avoid Lovecrafts, and I'm trying to find justifications to make the world building about as familiar as Dresden is, with different routes of getting there. Like fairies. Fairies are still going to be there. They're still going to have the similar restraints.
Right. So
because those are real world restraints.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm just trying to make different laws to get there. So,
right. It's the mythos. You want to hold the majority of the fairy mythos. Maybe you look at it because, doesn't Butcher, he pulls a lot from Norse and Irish, right?
Yeah.
So maybe if you could find some like different fairy tales about like maybe look at like Arabic or some other fairy tales that may deal with fairies and see how their rules, and maybe that's a way to do it.
I haven't directly involved fairies yet, but I have started talking about debts, and that's the structure that's very similar.
Okay, well that makes sense.
But it's like I have a couple of decent laws that like as the root of the world building, and I'm really happy with those. And so it's just like if I make debt seem normal and not Dresden related, I think I'll be
Well,
okay.
debts are very common in general. I mean, in most fairy tales, you know, everything comes with a price, etc. You know, there. I mean, hell, I mean that was one of the big things. And spoiler alert: in the new Avengers movie, was everything came with a price. So, you know, that's pretty ubiquitous. Most people, unless they knew you, would have a hard time going, yeah, she's ripping off Dresden here. I think you could pull that off pretty easily.
Urban fantasy in Chicago is not very popular. So when you have a data point of 2,
well, change the city.
no.
Yeah. I mean, it has to be
I
in
have
it.
had this argument with myself way too much.
But it like roll the dice and use like a medium-sized city like
No.
Phoenix.
There's so
Actually,
many
that's a
good
pretty big
cities
city.
that are closer to other things where you could, draw inspiration from them.
I need it to be really like a large city, a multi-million population large city that gets cold. So it's pretty much Chicago or New York. Chicago has the benefit if I've actually been there, I'm slightly familiar with it. I don't know a fucking thing about New York, and it's confusing.
There's Minneapolis, which is a big city, multi-millions. It gets cold.
Yes.
Seattle gets cold. Denver, Portland gets cold. Portland's on the small side.
Of like 1 million, way too small.
Yeah, Portland's small. It's probably too small.
Portland is smaller. Yeah, that would
Seattle and Minneapolis and Denver could all fit in there. You might be able to do Omaha. I don't know how big Omaha is.
Omaha's not a big.
No.
I mean, it's the bigger city that's in that state, but that state doesn't have a huge population.
It's the only city of that.
Hey, there's almost cities. There's almost cities that exist there. So
the towns.
Yeah,
I've never been.
A town with 700,000 people is a pretty big town, but
it's pretty
by city standards, yeah, I would agree. It's a small city.
Yeah.
Minneapolis, though, would be great because then you have the border to Canada. You have a little bit more trees and stuff. Because Chicago is surrounded by suburbs. There's no forest. There's no kind of that mysterious air that you could play around with if you want to. Like Minneapolis, you can drive 5 minutes any direction outside the city, and it's hills and forest and dense and misty and all sorts of stuff.
But
it's also a huge city. Like that's what I'm saying. You're based in the city, but you're surrounded by all these other things where creatures could hide or monsters could hide. Or
Minneapolis, St. Paul.
Way more than Chicago, where it's like they're hiding in plain sight. Like they could literally just not be in plain sight. They could just be coming into the city to do some stuff and then leaving. That's like Minneapolis is a huge place that people fly in and out of. Not like
it's big.
It's not quite like Chicago, but Minneapolis has a ton of traffic.
Yeah, it's 3.3 million between the Twin Cities, so it's pretty big city.
Yep.
And that's no one. I mean, that's part of like the fun thing about doing it in a city like Minneapolis. We all know New York. We all kind of know Chicago. No one knows fuck all about St. Paul. So it's the city itself is a mystery. Which, like we talked about last time, that may or may not be a good thing.
I think it'll be more fun.
I think one of the things is like I would basically only choose like LA, Chicago, or New York, but I dislike LA and New York for lots of reasons, so I end up going with Chicago. Because I want like the really urban thing, the city. Like we were saying, like for urban fantasies, it's really helpful to have tons of people all in one spot if you're trying to stretch plausibility.
And I think you would get that in a lot of cities because the urban environment, I mean, Kansas City has a very, very similar feel to it as Chicago if you're downtown. They both had mob involvement. They both are heavily driven by money. They're both old
there's
money.
Mob in Kansas City?
Yeah,
big
Kansas
time.
City mob.
Okay.
Kansas City, it started in Kansas City and went to Chicago because of the railroads, because you have all the trade going through Kansas City. And then you had the Prohibition where they got huge. Kansas City is actually where a lot of mob started before it went to Chicago and became big in Chicago. It didn't start picking up until after the Great Depression.
Seattle
Kansas
is
City was like
hugely urban if you
1905.
wanted to go Pacific Northwest. Like, there's all sorts of urban stuff in Seattle. And I could give you help with that one because I've been there several times.
And if you want to do more mob involvement stuff, Kansas City has all sorts of cool stuff too, and they have lots of Indian ties.
I'm taking
Yeah.
this is where you're from, Tyler.
Yeah.
I
I am
love
from
Kansas.
Kansas City.
That's one of my all-time favorite cities. Weirdly
Best
enough.
barbecue ever.
It is real good.
Yep.
Back when I was curling, there was always a bonspiel in Kansas City, and they smoked all their meat and stuff. It was the barbecue bonspiel. It was so fun. It was so good.
Smoked meats are the best way to do it.
Could always put it in Pittsburgh.
This is true.
Meh.
I mean, long story short, it doesn't really matter if it's in Chicago or not, because the setting is not where people are going to say, well, this
Right.
feels really familiar, except for maybe the first 20 pages. How you play off your character, what they do, and how you develop the plot and the backstory behind whatever system.
Now,
of
if you
attributes
wanted
use.
something that's just recognizable, you could always go with Washington, D.C. It gets cold, very urban, center of power, so powerful beings would be, drawn there. It would make sense.
Yeah, especially when you do political, like underground of like a
Mhm.
magic system that's tied in and rooted to all of the normal politics as well. Lots of options there.
I don't think I am willing to take on the headache of researching Washington, D.C.
DC also isn't. I don't think of DC as being a huge like mega
Mhm.
skyscraper city either. It doesn't have that real urban feel. I mean, I agree. DC is definitely very urban.
Right. It
But-
doesn't have the skyscrapers, but there's lots of walking, lots of people who live in the city who walk everywhere,
Yeah. And yeah, you definitely get that downtown feel when you're in DC.
Mm-hmm. Actually,
There's
gonna be-
options. I think, long story short, there's options.
None of them I like more than Chicago.
I'm going to be there in like a week and a half. It's going to be nice.
DC or Chicago?
DC.
DC.
Mhm.
Oh, you should let me know when you're there. I could head up there. It's just an hour and a half drive or 3-hour drive.
Nice. Yeah. We'll talk afterwards. Anyway,
Yeah.
so what's the topic?
Yes, the topic.
We've been going for 15 minutes now.
That's pretty good.
Okay, the topic was perspective and how or why or whatever we might do anything with choosing the perspective of how to tell a scene or a story or series. Insert word here. Perspective.
What I've been doing a lot of recently is the third person present perspective. That's because that's what we decided to do Andromeda's Love in. And that's really weird. It's
I
real
hate present perspective. I do.
I like it and dislike it all at the same time. Like transitioning back and forth is difficult, but once like 2 or 3 pages in, go in either direction, I tend to be okay with it. But it is confusing, and especially because it's not the way I normally write. Like I have to go back and change tenses all the time. Like, is this the right verb? And so I have to go back. And so that's, but I do like the action-y feel of it. Like it's much more gripping, I think, than past tense.
Present tense is usually reserved for thriller novels. If you want to like a book that's written where the entire length of the book takes place in story time over the course of maybe like 18 hours, like if 24 was to be written into a book, that would all be in present tense because it does
Right.
give you more of a sense of urgency and thrill, and you can kind of develop the mindset of now and then and everything as it progresses. Whereas past tense by definition is about telling a story, and while you can build and structure things to sound intense, that's present tense just naturally captures that, and you can get to the person's head a little bit more.
Right. And it also helps for more natural breaks in like flashbacks because the tense changes.
Mm-hmm.
When you're talking about something that happened, you talk past tense, and now is now. And so that is one thing I do really enjoy about it, is it does make that distinction a lot clearer because you can see it. You don't have to remember, oh, when is it? You're like, oh, well, past tense. Like you just naturally figure it out as a reader.
Well, I mean, we could almost make the topic just about tense, like the choice of tense and the choice of perspective, because both of those are how you outline how you want to write. You can
Right.
be a
We
writer.
don't plan things on this podcast. I'm not sure if you noticed.
Oh, we came up with this at least 30 seconds before we hit start record. So
Yeah, that's strict plan for us. Ugh.
Right. And right. Because then you got to go into like, is it third person omniscient or third person limited, which is difficult to do.
Wait, why is limited difficult for you?
I write almost exclusively in limited, so I would say it's not difficult to do.
When I do third person, I default to omniscient.
That is weird.
That's like very old school way of writing.
I guess. I mean, I don't know, but that's just how I do it. So it's just difficult for me to get into that limited, like, especially when I'm trying to figure out exactly what to put and what to hide and what to keep. What to show and what to hide from the reader with the different perspectives. It's just the back and forth can be difficult for me.
I think the only thing I've read of yours from start to finish was the blurb of Coralex without jumping around too much. And
Yeah.
Coralex was written in third person limited, so
Yeah.
and I thought that was really good. So I'd be interested to read some of your third person omniscient though, because omniscient with all the different perspectives, whether it be first person, third person, limited, third person omniscient, even within that you can split it up even further with how you want to write, because you have a very narrow omniscient that will jump in where it's kind of like looming over an area, like where the people are, like you're in the room somewhere and you'll call out things that they didn't see. There's narrative omniscient, to where you allude to things that will happen or could happen that they maybe didn't quite catch. And then you obviously have just a third person omniscient where you can just state whatever you want.
Right.
Kind of like how Lord of the Rings was written.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I kind of feel that Harry Potter definitely went more towards that third person omniscient, because there's a lot of, this is just why things are, explain and keep going kind of thing.
Yeah, where they almost address the audience almost directly with explaining something, because it's like no character is currently focused on this. You just decided that it was important at the time. And that's kind of the direction of omniscient versus limited, is where the focus is. Because you shouldn't be, if you're doing third person limited, you shouldn't be focused on anything besides what the characters would reasonably pick up on. Even if it's in a glancing motion over, they're just getting a quick survey of the screen or the scene. Then, two sentences to just say, this was here, this was there, it was dark, the room felt like this, and then you move on to whatever's going on. Like, those are things that people would notice, even if they're not consciously paying attention. That is still from their perspective. Whereas third person omniscient, you could take a lot more time. You can do that in limited too, but it feels a little bit more forced and limited if you spend too much time describing scenery. But
that's sort of always the back and forth, is how much do I describe and how much does the audience find out through interaction? And that's one of the things I always have issues with. So I tend to under-describe. So I've just been working really hard on my descriptions for the last 3 months.
Well, descriptions kind of fall into two different trains of thought, at least when I'm writing. It's that, you have the show don't tell, because there are certain things you just have to tell people. Like you need to tell them. But then you can also show, if you talk about someone, so if you just state that a person is short, or you state that the person had to stand up on their tippy toes to reach into the lower cabinet over the table or whatever, or wherever it is, then you show that they're short and that they're struggling, that height is something they're consciously aware of. So easy example of that, where
it's the non-physical that's easier to tell. Like if you're describing a room, that tends to be more telly than actions, and people tend to be more showy.
Because we don't interact with our environment as a whole.
Right.
That makes sense. You have to tell people about what something
we
looks
just
like.
See it and we understand it for the most part.
Absolutely. And if you want to use a flashback here and there to kind of pepper the show don't tell, where you relate it to why the character would notice a certain detail, just with a little, because how someone observes their world, even if they just stay quiet the entire time, there's plenty of great silent characters that are written, and they're very characterized by how they observe their world around them and what it makes them feel or think or interact, even if it's a very passive interaction. So other things you can do with that too, if you find yourself telling too much, just find a way that it interacts with your character. Find a way to tell the audience about something through how your character perceives it. I forgot what the second thing I was going to say that dealt with that. Yeah, if you start describing a room too much, show versus tell is, I think, the more important thing, especially with third person limited, because again, it's kind of like the Chekhov's gun. Is that the right term?
Yeah,
right?
Chekhov's
Or
gun.
if you're describing something too much, then it should have some level of importance. Oh yeah, pacing. When that was the other thing. Something that limits how much description you put into a scene is based off of the pacing. Because if you want to slow things down, you can always spend more time elaborating and describing things. Whereas no one is going to pay attention to how the room looks if you are diving through the room because someone is shooting at you in the other room.
Right.
You may land and crash into some furniture, and it's like, that's going to be, oh, well, hey, there's furniture. I found it with my shoulder. That's not something you're going to pay attention to passively. It's something you're going to find out is true because that's the last thing on your concern. So pacing is description is a great way to control pacing, and you can really ruin or set pacing based off your level of description. Both good things for third person limited.
Both, yes.
Also any limited perspective would be able to have this effect. I'm fairly certain Terry Pratchett could have broken all of the rules we've just described and still made it work, because he would have just paused the whole fight in order to describe something really small in extreme detail and then made it funny.
But the way the prose would be set up for a scene like that and how he does the delivery would probably make it work in some way. I mean, what's the overarching theme of every episode? If you can do it well, then
it doesn't matter.
There are
no rules.
Yeah, there's no rules if you do it well.
If you do well, right.
Yep. So, but good rules if you're, starting to write, or if you write consistently to keep track of is, am I ruining the pacing of the scene? Does the scene flow like I wanted it to based off the descriptions I'm using? So, and dialogue is, dialogue you can pepper in descriptions too. A great way to make dialogue flow better is not just to have two people standing at attention, just speaking like robots back and forth to each other, but to pepper it with other things that are going on. Because when people are talking with each other, as I can see both of you on camera, looking away at other things, probably thinking of other things, that's what happens during normal conversations too. And those are things that you can write about your characters is, if you don't just have dialogue.
Monologue.
Yeah.
The internal monologue to help explain the external dialogue.
Mm-hmm. And this is originally what I wanted to talk about, but because with perspective, I wanted to talk about dialogue, but it's writing. You can talk about anything. It's all related, right? Tangentially.
We ramble. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, it doesn't matter.
So
we don't edit on this podcast.
No one has time for that.
No one edits.
First try every time, unless you lose it, and then you have to redo it.
And then we lose the numbers, and we get stuck.
But that would never happen.
It only happened once.
So far.
Single data point. It exists. So, have either of you ever tried writing in first person?
Mm-hmm.
How did it go?
For some reason, I don't have issues with first person or third person limited. Those are the only things I ever do. I always do past tense. I don't try to move away from that because I don't want that to be the thing that draws attention most of the time. Once in a while with first person, I can have fun drawing attention to it, much like you will find in the Dresden Files. But a lot of times it's just kind of more structural than trying something to bring attention to.
Do you ever address the audience when you wrote in first person, like a narrative first person, like where you'd say well, comma, and then I went and did this, don't know what I was thinking, where they have their own, they're basically commentating on their own story, where they're almost addressing an invisible audience?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sometimes I did have fun with that, but I would use it very sparingly.
It's the best way to do comedy in first person, in my opinion. I can't write comedy unless it's in first person and doing stuff like that.
I used to only write first person, but I had a lot of struggles, and this was early on in my writing, so I might be able to go back to it at some point, but I haven't had a chance to do it in a couple of years, really.
I wrote a little short story in first person recently, and I remembered why I loved it so much and also why I stopped doing it. But it feels really samey to me to write that way. It's harder to develop scenes, I feel, when you're doing first person, just because it's, I don't know, maybe that's probably just my problem. I definitely read first person narratives where the scenes were very well done. I can't do it. I spend too much time with internal monologue. I get into the character's head and stick there for way too long whenever I'm in first person. Whereas third person, I seem to be way more conscious of the flow and the pacing of the whatever portion I'm writing at the time.
I do think there's like a spectrum of how much are you, I hate to overuse this phrase, but bringing attention to the fact it's first person, because sometimes the prose of a first person story can be very similar to third person limited. With if the person's just kind of watching something else happening, then there's no reason to like, I think this happened or I saw this happen or something like that. It's like you're describing it, we know they're seeing it happen. So there can be some almost like your perspective changing as you're writing it. It'll help you like slide on that spectrum however you want it to do.
Yeah, and there's definitely a spectrum. I mean, with a limited perspective, there's also kind of a spectrum too with how much you choose to go. I mean, like I said, there's definitely ways to break up each of the perspectives and go as detailed as you want in whichever direction you want, because all of them are just kind of a baseline for what type of book you're going to write. Someone's like, I'm going to write a high fantasy, third person, multi-perspective, limited perspective. You're like, okay, then I can instantly categorize what I would kind of expect from those types of genres.
Yeah, I do seem to switch which perspective I want to write in based on genre of the story. And it never, half the time I don't even notice I've made that decision, but I never have an issue with it.
Yeah, the one first person story I really want to write, and I tend to go first person when I'm trying to be a bit more meta with my decisions, is one where the main character is actually the bad guy.
Because you're hiding that info, I assume?
Right, but the thing is as the reader, you're supposed to be able to figure it out by the end, that he's actually the bad guy. And so when he dies or gets captured or whatever, it's actually a good thing.
But he's probably sympathetic to some point because everyone's been inside his head for the entire book.
Exactly.
So, it's still a perspective issue.
Right, but it would be really hard to do that in anything but first person.
I think this is a great segue. And the other thing I want to talk about with third person limited. So I don't know if there's a term for it. So I always call super limited or limited. And the differentiation between those would be where your limited perspective changes your narrative voice to fit the characters, to where you limit the type of vocabulary that you're using, limit it based off of what that character would say, where you phrase things in the way that character is, such as if it's a younger character, where it's all written and flows well with how you write, but you limit how you're telling the story almost as if it's from it's literally from that character's perspective. You would never use a word that they wouldn't use. I mean, except in some instances where there's no other way to talk about something. But if something is like some really complex thing and this person just has like a nickname for it, and then that's what you use to describe it. If someone doesn't have a word for cell phone, you're just like, yeah, that phone thing, or whatever term you come up with.
Thing.
Yeah. The thing that daddy holds up to the side of his head. It's when he talks to those important people. And that's what the entire scene that you're writing from that perspective is, not only from their perspective and very limited, but it's also within the mind and the language that they would use.
So and that's something first person, but it's third, essentially.
It is third person because you are still allowed to talk about things that are in their surrounding that they would not be thinking about, but it's still their telling of the story. So yeah, it's very much like a first person in the way that like first person addressing the audience, but from their perspective. So it's in third person because you're the one that's writing about it in third person.
So it's like a second person.
Yeah, almost like over the shoulder. Yeah, it's like over the shoulder, like the second person, where it's like
it's pretty close.
It's so limited third person to where, and I think you could, if you want to do something like that, where you're writing about a villain, to where you want to get into their head and you want to jump between the benefits of first person with the internal monologue and the very, very limited perspective, but you still want to write from a third person limited perspective. There's ways to do that because third person limited is the most versatile form of writing, in my opinion.
It kind of sounds like you're trying to talk about voice. I mean, at least that's what I end up frustrating myself over when I'm worrying about voice, is like if I'm having different perspectives in the same story, is I do want those chapters, they'll say, to sound different. Like this does belong to that character. So their vocabulary and everything would change, the word choice, the prose, everything would change a little bit to match that character. pretty much anyone that I've paid attention to that did that well. Like you already read them. I already know. Cinder Spires was a wonderful example.
Yes, exactly. No, yeah. And I'm curious if either of you have ever tried writing something like that, where you have a young, let's say 8 to 10-year-old character, and then within the same scene, where if you choose to swap perspectives, or the next chapter that's just continuing off of that same scene, have someone who is almost a polar opposite, like a very analytical, intelligent, more adult-like figure who uses very different terminology. And then you have some overlap where they're describing the same scenes, but you get to see how one person's very depressed about it, and the other person's just like, this is great. And they both observe the same thing, and now you get to see individual characters.
That would be more of an internal monologue than, like, I think a third-person perspective description, especially for, like, how people are viewing it. It would be more about them talking to themselves and then, like, in their thought processes versus actually, like, trying to write it. I don't know. That's just my thought.
I don't think it detracts from the perspective, though, because going back to, if you want to describe what's going on, if you want to describe a scene by show, don't tell, with the example I was using of how someone feels about what's in their surroundings, how, let's say they're comparing it to their past, and let's say they're poor and it's a wealthy area and there's like a bunch of nice things going on, and that's how you just choose to describe the scenery of the room rather than just saying there was nice stuff in the room. You go to the character's reaction. Doing similar things like that, where the scene just keeps on rolling, the person never stops. It's just their reactions is based on the voice of the character that you're writing. I think that was exactly what I was looking for.
Yeah, I mean,
the
that
perspective and the voice of what you're writing, and to have two polar that was something I tried. It was like, choose have two very opposite characters, where their voices were very different. But I started the scene with the little girl as they're walking through this facility, and all the rules that she had to follow, because she was like, basically, take your dad to work today. And then it was the dad who's from his perspective, where the girl is not actually his daughter. He's her caretaker, and she's an experiment. And so he feels really bad about it. And they're all just seeing the same stuff, where it's like these flowers they created, but they all limit the amount of senses. They limit the amount of exposure, the amount of experience that these experiments have, because it'll break the experiment if they have too many variances of differences in experience.
Mm-hmm.
Not going into the details of the story, but that was the basis of it. It was just them basically walking through the facility, started out on the girl's perspective, then went to the guy's perspective. And it was just all one continuous scene. It's very short, but the perspective, I swapped it halfway in between to try something like that.
Right. But that also brings up other questions of how many perspectives should you have? Because I mean, some people have said you should only have one per chapter. Like, you should never swap. So if you have 3 characters, one chapter can only be for one person, from their perspective. So I mean, obviously, if you can do it, you can do it. But I don't know. I've had different people tell me different things.
I think that's the best rule to go by, is just per chapter, or if in the middle of a chapter, if a chapter is too short and you have a huge page break and you make it very obvious that it's a different scene, a different character, have a very clear distinction and break between when you swap characters. But yeah, that's definitely the best rule to follow, in my opinion. Like, if anyone's going to agree upon rules of writing, if you're doing multi-perspective, each chapter should be its own person. You can have short chapters. There's very short chapters that exist. I know you guys talked about that on at least one episode.
Yeah.
And as soon as you're ready to move to a different character, just change the chapter. That's fine. Do what you need to do with that chapter and then move on. It's
that kind of thing that actually weirded me out about third-person omniscient. Like, I got so used to, like, there's at least...
Uh-oh.
Oh, she's gone.
We lost her.
Yeah, talking about chapter length, a friend of mine was like, he's really starting to get into some writing. I'm just like, he's like, how long should my chapters be? I'm like, well, how long do you need them to be? Like, my shortest chapter is like 3 sentences.
Chapters are supposed to have some form of progression based off of the character. And this is another cool thing with multi-perspective, is that each person has their own internal, like, character development and their plot, and they have their own, like, miniature rise and fall and, like, 3-act structure within the overall book structure. I think we lost her entirely.
Yep. She
and
can jump back on.
Absolutely. And you like I think Cinder Spire series is a good example. It's something I read recently, where you have 4 characters' perspectives, and each of them has their own goal. Like the author has a narrative purpose for all of them, of their own rising action and development and growth and kind of climactic point within their own story.
Hmm.
And all of those can happen simultaneously, or one of them can reach their climax and then join the rest of the story because they're not doing any personal development from that point forward. And all these things can be happening while the overall plot of the book is going on at the same time. And that's something
it
fun
gets
you can do.
really difficult because then you got to like sort of flow the stories because it is really like an ABCD story structure.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, if it's four people, it's a ABCDE because you got your A, which is the main plot, and then your 4 characters that are flowing together.
And you want to make sure that if you want to play off that tension, right? Especially if you have like a very emotional, intense moment where someone who is connecting with that character of yours is going to be really blown away by whatever this is, the thing that you accomplished throughout that story.
Mm-hmm.
And you want to make sure that that point, that like crescendo of when that hits, and then you transition the next chapter, that you don't lose that momentum. That's why you kind of want to line them up to kind of fall like, all right, well, this person just had this epic success, and you jump over to a scene where other people are struggling, and like you would expect to see either an epic failure or success happen there, because you want to have this huge roller coaster go on towards, when the climactic moments are supposed to happen, where you have that kind of tension of, are they going to succeed? Are they not going to succeed? Like this should all be happening around the same time. So yeah, something you have to pay attention to is your timing when you have 4 individual peaks that you're trying to hit at separate points in the story, unless all of them just kind of climax at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, ideally, and if you can see this in a lot of like, especially like superhero movies, they reach their peak right before the final battle. Like
they have that character growth that lets them get through the challenge. Which,
right.
Yeah. 3-act structure. That's
perfect.
It's a great way to do superhero movies, and they all do it pretty well. I think Marvel does pretty good job.
Marvel does a pretty good job of it. Yeah. What's been interesting is I've got a character in Andromeda's Love that she's got the memories and personality of she's real young, like 19.
Mm-hmm.
But she's also got like been implanted with these memories and like consciousness almost of a like older woman. So it's one sort of like going back and forth in perspectives where I'll swap the perspectives of the person in their head. So it's not 2 different people. It's the same person that I'll kind of weave these 2 perspectives back and forth together.
Caught me at a time when I was coughing. Had to mute myself.
It's all right.
That's interesting. I haven't read Andromeda's Love. I know you at least have the first version done?
Not
Rough
quite.
draft 1? Almost. It's close. It has to be close, right?
Yeah, well, that's what I was talking about earlier. Probably like 15 to 20,000 words away.
How exciting.
Yeah, well, when we started out, we were like, all right, we'll do like 75,000 words.
It's never enough.
And we're getting into the 3rd act, and we're like 72,000. And so
perfect time to approach it.
Perfect. Yeah. So I'm just like, well, I guess we're not going to hit our mark here.
You could just do one of those really unsatisfying things that are like, and here's the end, 2 pages, and just the end, just credits.
Well, but the thing is,
what the hell was with that? Oh,
right.
I know what your original plan was for Andromeda's Love, where it was supposed to be sort of bitter.
Right, but there's this we've been building up this final thing for a long time now, and now we got to pay it off, or it's just not going to work. Like we've been building up this sort of hyperspace jump to this unknown location for 70,000 words, pretty much, and now it's time to do it.
Are you still going with a similar ending like what we were discussing originally?
I think so.
Spoil anything on here?
Yeah, I think so. But that is interesting because we do swap between 4 different characters in the story for their perspective. So each chapter is from one of the main 4/5 perspectives, and each of them have, for the most part, have had their sort of storylines.
Now, there's a spectrum of sequential versus parallel, where you get what I'm talking about, time frame, where the moment that one chapter ends, you assume that the other chapter begins based off of chronologically where you're writing it, even though your character jumping. It's like this character handled, between 5 o'clock and 6 o'clock, and then right at 6 o'clock when they swap who the perspective is, they pick up right from there. There's no overlap.
Right. That's what we do. Is like
Okay. Yeah.
if there is, I mean, may not be like, yeah, there's definitely no overlap.
It may be like 5:55, like they're picking up what the last person was saying and then moving into their scene.
Or I mean,
or there's a gap, but it's all
right.
There's no overlap. Either it's continuous or it goes further.
Chronological order. That's for sure.
That's something.
Go ahead.
That's something else I think that's one of the advantages of multi-perspective is you can do overlap to. I think we just talked about this. I talked about doing it sequentially, where you show observing two different scenes, but you can also do overlap where you tell a chapter through one person's eyes, and then you tell the chapter through the other person's eyes, and you jump like halfway through where that other person's chapter was, and you finish out how they had just finished that scene, but from the other person's perspective. And sometimes that can be really, really telling, and there is cool things that you can do with it.
Well, it's very was it Rashomon? Is that the name of the movie I think I'm thinking of? Where they're trying to figure out what happened in this court case, and so they have like 5 witnesses, and they're all telling a different tale of the same story.
Mm-hmm. And so they keep going back to a different point. It's not exactly the same starting point to finish each time. You're not watching 5 of the same stories. They all jump in at a different point, and they all terminate at a different point, probably in a different location too, because they're different people. But that is something that's cool that you can do with third person or with limited or multi-perspective.
Well, and it's something, if you did it like that, you could, if you did it right, you could pick up on, the story would pick up when something important or interesting happened to the character. So, this thing X happened and it caught their attention. So they turn to it, and that's when their story picks up. So all the stuff that may have been super important to character A, like the first 20 minutes of it is not important to character B. And so if you could do that where everything was, built off of a trigger, it could be a very interesting way to tell a story.
I know here I'm going to talk about Wheel of Time since the other guest is not here, or the other host is not here that talks about it. So in Wheel of Time, that actually happens a few times. Robert Jordan and Brandon Sanderson both did it. And not only did they not split it up into multiple chapters, they did multiple perspective within the same chapter, but it was also with overlap, where it was when this climactic or very important scene happened, such as when the male side of the source was cured, which I know was talked about like maybe 2 episodes ago, when the tainted side of the magic, which makes people go crazy, was the driving motivation behind like 9 books of why all this was happening, was cured and led up to the final battle. They jump between, I think, like 7 perspectives of like, where was this person when it happened and how did they feel about it? Where was this person when it happened? How did they feel about it? And it jumped around, and there was like 2 paragraphs, page break, 2 paragraphs, page break, 3 sentences, page break. They wanted to make sure that you saw how everyone felt about it before moving on past that scene, because it was such a impactful, triumphant 10,000 page lead up to this point. And they still have 4,000 pages to go. So even in the final battle that happens in book 14 that Brandon Sanderson wrote, he continued that. He did that again for, I think, in 2 of the books, at least in the final book. The way they wrapped it up when everything was fixed was they were jumping in between scenes, or he jumped between scenes that were happening, and he would retell that scene but from a different perspective. He'd do that 2 or 3 times and then progress this. Then the timeline would continue to progress.
It just feels like cheating. Like you get all this extra page count because you're doing the same scene from a different perspective.
But it's so, I think, I don't know, like I said, if you do it well, you do it right. And I think with the scene that was going on there, that there were so many characters, like Wheel of Time has like 18 protagonists and like 13 antagonists, and all of them are very developed. And there's a lot of antagonists I really cared what happened to them, because of, not just because they were like a sympathetic villain, but because their motivation was interesting, and I wanted to see, are they going to swap sides? Like, they have a lot of these redeeming qualities. Why did they still not serve the good? Like, so it's if people are invested in certain characters, I think you're doing it justice to develop a scene by rewarding people's investment in those characters to see how each of
Right.
them react, especially if it deals with them, because there's certain things where it's this triumphant moment, but it only applies to 3 people. Now, you may not particularly care for this character because you think they're bland, but maybe you care about this other character. So if you get to see all 3 of them, it was short. It wasn't intrusive. It didn't feel like it interrupted the flow or pacing. I was on the edge of my seat the whole time, like waiting to see what would happen. So
Nice.
like it was pulled off well, but that's not something I don't think I've seen anywhere else except for The Wheel of Time. Doing
Right.
that overlap third person, and like he does some third person omniscient stuff most of the time it's third person limited, but he does some like omniscient stuff that it's tossed in it here and there. But he has like 40 perspectives that he jumps between throughout like the 14 books, and it doesn't feel like it's too much because you still know who the core characters are.
Yeah, that's just too much. I don't know if I can do that. Like
I don't.
I have these big worlds but limited scope, and that's kind of how like Dresden works. Is by the time what's the most recent book? Skin Game. By the time the kid came out, like that was a really it's an expansive universe. We covered phase and vampire, all this crap. But it's very limited around Dresden and what's going on with him.
And so, yeah, so it's like not too big of a pill to swallow at any given time, even if it's, for what it is. And I think that's a great approach to a book. I think that targets a certain audience who likes to see that progression, especially since, like we discussed, it's entirely from his perspective the whole time, too. And there's a lot of stuff that he knows that he doesn't share at any given time just because he knows all this background information. The story is not written where he's just exposition
Right.
of like what all the implications are. You just kind of get to see it as it comes along, and unless it's relevant for the story, he never brings it up. Even if you're like, I know you know more, please tell me just a little bit, like you've been involved in all this stuff, you know about this huge world, like especially me, I'm in like book 2, so I'm like, what? There has to be more. Like you have alluded to the conversation you had with that person and the smirk on your face that you knew more, and I want to know more. So like that keeps me reading, even if within the context of the story, everything that's important will eventually be addressed. It just could be several books later.
Right. Yeah, that's something that Butcher does well. Is he'll pay something off like 7 books later.
That the first time I'd ever seen that was I was reading Robert Jordan in The Wheel of Time. Something that came up in like book 2 and 3. I was like, he was planning this the whole time, and you know that he was because of the way that the structure of it is done and the way the way it's all executed. You're like, how many little seeds has he planted throughout like the first 4 books that are going to show up for the remaining 10? And you get to see it, and it's very impressive. And that's something. It's like I don't know how someone could have that sort of scope to write something like that. Like that's such a huge undertaking. There's very few authors who do it and pull it off well.
One thing that I've been thinking about recently in terms of perspective is the antagonist perspective. Because a lot of times the big bad is just a big bad. They're evil because they're evil, etc.
And that's so cliche, and I hate that because none of my antagonists are like that. I spend a lot of time on my antagonists personally.
Right, but like in Infinity War, one of the cool things about that movie, if you watch it, it's essentially an origin story for Thanos. He gets all of his motivations explained. He gets why he's doing it, why things are important, et cetera, et cetera.
How he thinks it out and all that.
Right. So, and it's not just this person believes they're right. This person believes they're right because of this, and this. And it really has created I think the best villain in the Marvel universe so far. But it's don't MacGuff. I guess, even if it's a limited perspective, so to speak, don't MacGuffinize your antagonist unless you just need to, or that's just kind of how the story is.
And sometimes antagonists are red herrings, where the lesson that you're trying to teach, like the thematic point of the entire narrative, the entire story, is more important than just that bad guy being stopped from whatever limited thing he was trying to do. And then maybe you don't necessarily need to develop an antagonist unless it's going to be one of those, well, the antagonist realized he was wrong and now he's trying to undo it, like at the end, something like that. Right. I don't think that's just for children's books. I think there are a lot of redeemable villains who could turn. I just don't. I think that makes bad for dramatic prose because people like to see people die in the end.
Right. Well, it's also, there's also the ticking clock antagonist, right? Where there are people that get in the way, and if they're hurdles, you don't really need as much of a reason to do it, because they're cops or they're evil faction or whatever. It's different than just going in and saying, okay, you need this whole thing because the actual bad guy is time.
Yeah. And you see a lot of that with like let's say an asteroid's about to crash, like Armageddon, right?
Disaster movies is a big one where
that's all it's using is time as a perspective, because time is, here's this deadline. We need to figure out whatever we need to figure out. These characters need to grow and overcome whatever struggles they need to overcome before this very, very intrinsic timer where we all get obliterated.
Right. And so like sometimes it feels a little overused because it does create artificial tension, or it can. Especially if it's like, okay, why, if you're going to use timers, you've got to you got to be specific as to why this took so long. Because if they do something for a long time that's stupid, the readers are going to get pissed off.
Exactly, yeah. Mishandling timers is just as infuriating as having a artificial timer with no justification.
Yeah.
Where it's like, we need to get down and we need to rescue this person and it needs to happen right now. It's like they end up throwing away half their people. 2 characters end up dying and you're like, why didn't you just... It was a hostage situation. Like, why don't you talk it out? Like, was there a different way to approach this?
Right.
And it's like you create all this attention of these people dying and all this drama, and you're like, there had to have been a better way to do that. Why were you in such a rush? Why did this character make this uncharacteristic call to do this course of action? And that's when timers can really bite you, where it's like, all right, this feels forced with forced actions based off of a forced plot, and then everything just starts to kind of come apart because the characters become kind of unbelievable. It's the same thing as having a baby for the sake, and then characters interacting a different way around having a baby, right? Where it's like,
don't get me started on the child for child's sake just to cause strife. Oh my god!
And then the character acting out of character. That's the same thing that happens with any timer, because you have some form of stress that's introduced, some form of tension, some form of conflict, and then characters mishandle that conflict in a way that's out of character. If you have a person mishandle conflict because that is their character, that's very different than having someone handle something out of character and then ruining everything. It's like, well, you never would have done that. Why did you do it this time?
Right.
It's just like the stubborn person did something that a stubborn person would do, and that caused the conflict. That can be a little ham-handed at times, but at least it doesn't break the character immersion. It's like, all right, well, they literally went to the worst person they possibly could have to talk about peace after you just killed his family, right? And it's a scenario where it's like, it's going to go poorly way before it happens, and so it doesn't feel as forced, except for the fact that you made them approach that character because
right. And this would be another good way to do perspective. Is if someone is going to act out of character, there's got to be, from their perspective, there's got to be explanation as to why.
Yes, they had to have. If you think of how humans or people are a sum of their experiences, and they make decisions, like logical decisions, based off of their experiences, and if they act a certain way and they're of a certain age, then they're going to be more consistent over time. And if you have something that's way out of left field or right field, that's way off their spectrum of experiences, where it's so intense that they have no reference level to fall back on, and they're going to act out of something. Let's say they act just out of emotion and they do what they felt was right at the time, and that turned out to be wrong. That needs to be the focus of your character development from that point, is them rectifying that decision or justifying that decision that they made at that time, or at least a lot of internal strife with them dealing with, I shouldn't have done that. They need to recognize that they shouldn't have done that. It shouldn't just be, oh, well, that was the decision I made at the time, and then you just roll with it. It's like, oh, we ran into all these problems. That needs to be the focus. You can do...
Unless it's in their character to just blow shit off.
Yeah. But if you have a consistent character where a baby is born and the person decides to do all these irrational things because someone was like, hey, this is your kid now, and they do something irrational, they should be beat up. They should be beating themselves up over why they were irrational if they eventually recognize the fact that, and if they never recognize it, it's like, well, then you're at a character and you don't even know why. You're just way too caught up. You're way too lost in the situation. I don't think that's a realistic adult. At least not any character I'd want to read.
Right. I mean, that has ruined so many things for me. Like
No, I know. I've listened to every episode. I know.
The fucking like surprise, you got a girl pregnant 10 years ago. Here's a child. Because people, it's irrational for rational sake. And it's just, I fucking hate it.
And that's a tangent I've heard before.
Oh.
Well, so to get back on perspective, if you're doing limited perspective, yeah, I think a chapter per person, unless you're trying to do something very special and very epic. Basically, if you're doing anything that breaks the rules, do it sparingly and do it intentionally. Don't accidentally do it. It's the same thing with like repetition. If you're going to use repetition in a sentence and it's going to ruin your whole story structure or your whole paragraph structure by doing the exact same sentence structure 3 times in a row, you better be doing it intentionally. Don't accidentally let me catch you using the exact same noun, exact same verb with a comma at the same place and doing the exact same sentence structure 3 times. Don't start 3 sentences with they unless you meant to.
Right.
Just, and that kind of falls with character perspective too, where if you're going to use a character, they need to be being used for the narrative purpose that you decided for them to be used for, to where you decided they were the best character to use for that scene, because either you wanted to show how little they knew, or you wanted to show how much they knew, and you wanted to show some stuff that was going on, or whatever your purpose you come up with is. And then stick to that perspective. I think 1 per chapter, I think, is the best advice you can give anyone who's starting a book. Like, hey, caution, danger. If you choose to go out of any writing rule, you're going to be critiqued and criticized for it if you don't do it well. You're at least going to be critiqued every single time, like, oh, they did this, no one ever does that. And hey, at least they pulled it off correctly.
Right. And I think a good tip for that is like, write down the perspectives, or maybe even write down unique examples for each perspective. Because that's something I did a bit with Androma's Love. Because what happened is, so we got 4 characters, and I'm co-writing that with a friend of mine, and we each took 2 of them and built them separately. And so we built them all, and so it's like playing with someone else's toys. But in doing that, we had to create such specific examples of how these people act that you can just go back and reference. Oh, this is what this person would do, or this is this person's mindset. So we have these extra notes and stuff that really help us decide what this character is. And I think that's a good thing to do, even if it's just 2 people. Just take 1,000 words and write down stuff about each character and how they're going to react.
That's actually something that Jim Butcher talked about when he first wrote the Dresden series, when he was talking with his English professor. If you ever sat in any of his lectures, he talks about how creating a quick format of your character and like kind of nailing down the details of your character before you start using them in writing is extremely helpful as kind of a reference where you can always kind of read that quick little 1,000-word blurb, let's say it's just 2 pages, before you start writing from that perspective, because you write a whole chapter, you're going to be invested in that chapter for a while, just to kind of quickly refresh you of, what the basis of that character is. And then as things happen throughout the story, just keep adding little blurbs onto there to remind you this is how they were and these are the few things that have changed them. Just kind of put you in that mindset of, I'm writing this character. And if someone else wants to tack on, like especially if you're doing a co-op thing, I do a lot of co-op writing because that's where I started with my writing for whatever reason. And we almost never touch each other's characters. If it's a multi-perspective, multiple character writing format with, let's say it's 2 people or 3 people, I usually just do 2 people, then we almost never touch each other's characters. And if we intend to have our other characters do stuff or act, we always like kind of, hey, would this person act this way, if we're not confident? But once you've been writing with each other for a while and you kind of have that baseline, then yeah, even the same terminology, we play with the other kids' toys.
Right.
It's very much how that co-op writing kind of works. But it's important to respect that character and not develop someone else's character for them unless you know what you're doing. I figure after 70,000 words you have a pretty damn
well,
good
the thing with
at that point.
The thing with having the outline is, depending on how we break up chapters and story arcs and stuff. You like, there's certain characters I may not write in for like 3 months. So I'm like, oh crap, I need it from this person's perspective. So I got to go back, reread, get comfortable with them again, because I've been writing in, character A and B's stories for, 3 months now or whatever. So that's another good reason to do it.
And yeah, especially if you're going to spend time away from a character, it's extremely helpful for sure.
Yeah. Well,
where's Alex based out of? Just curious. Is it a language issue? Like, what do you think's the issue with the internet?
There's no telling. Well, I mean, I think we've hit just about everything. We're getting about our time. So thanks for coming out. Sorry, Director Alex fans, that something happened and she's gone. But check us out, brokenjars.xyz, patreon.com/broken jars. We have all sorts of reward tiers and do all sorts of cool stuff. Hang out with us on Discord. I am at Jacob Ingles on Twitter. Tyler, do you want to plug anything, or are you good?
I don't have anything to plug except for plugging your guys' Discord channel. I would like to get more involved with the community if any of you guys are writers and want to have people to look at stuff and like develop kind of a community of writing and kind of review each other's stuff, talk about some of the subjects, not just talk about the podcast, but, actually form a writing community. So I invite you all to come out. It's a good time. These are good people.
All right. Well, y'all have a good one. See you next time.
Yep.